Hey, good morning. Welcome to today's daily devotional. We are in the Gospel of Matthew, and today we are going to just focus in on one thing. We're going to cover verses 11 through 25 of chapter 27. We are almost at the end of our study of the Gospel of Matthew, or at the end of these daily devotionals in the Gospel of Matthew. We are just about at the crucifixion of Jesus. He is in the final hours before the crucifixion, and right now he is in the midst of the Roman trial. So today, that's all we're going to look at is the Roman trial. We started addressing it yesterday. Jesus was falsely accused and falsely tried before the religious rulers of the day, the Jewish religious rulers. They wanted him to be crucified. They wanted him to be put to death. They didn't have the power to do it, but they falsely accused him, falsely tried him in an illegal trial. Then they had a fake. Another fake trial to try to make it seem and appear legal. They were leading him away in order to try him before Pilate. And that's where we saw the difference between how Peter was handling the situation and how Judas handled the situation. Peter was repentant and broken. Judas was remorseful, yet never broken, never really grieving himself, his own sin. And because he didn't come to the foot of the cross, he didn't come to Jesus for forgiveness. He took his own life trying to fix the mistake he had made himself. That will never happen. For us, we need God's forgiveness. We need to come to Jesus in brokenness, in mourning, in grieving, sad over the condition of our lives, sad over the sin that we have committed. And when we come to Him like that, He will forgive us and restore us and put us back into right relationship with Him. Well, Jesus was being led to this Roman trial before Pontius Pilate. And today we see that Jesus now is standing before Pontius Pilate. Let's go through the events of this story, chapter 27, verses 11 through 25 today. Now, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" So Jesus said to him, "It is as you say." And while he was being accused by the chief priests and the elders, he answered nothing. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" But he answered him not one word, so the governor marveled greatly. So Jesus is standing before this Roman governor. He was not Jewish in any way. He was the Roman ruler, the Roman governor who had been assigned to govern over Israel, over this troubled area that the Romans controlled. History shows that Pontius Pilate was a cruel and ruthless man, unkind to the Jews, very unkind to the Jews. He was very contemptuous of almost everything. He just wanted power. He wanted to have raw power. And it seems out of character in the way, in this story, in the way that he treated Jesus. Jesus must have profoundly affected him in some way, because Pilate was actually having a conversation. Pilate actually showed a little bit of mercy and kindness toward him, although he listened to the crowd instead of listening to what Jesus had to say, or listening even to the warnings that were going to be given. Now, the book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, condenses the full account down into just basically one encounter, one story. Luke actually describes that there's two appearances before Pilate. If you look at Luke chapter 23, verses 1 through 12. There's a first appearance before Pilate, hoping that he didn't have to make a judgment. He sent Pilate to Herod, who was the sub-ruler of Galilee. Herod would have been a Jew. He was the sub-ruler of Galilee. Herod would have been one of the sons of Herod the Great that we met at the very beginning of the Gospel of Matthew. This Herod was also just as wicked. Herod refused to do anything, and he sent him back to Pilate. And that's what Matthew is describing. He's condensing the whole account into one story. And so Pontius Pilate asked Jesus that question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" That's one of the accusations that the Jewish leaders had about Jesus, saying that he says he's the king of the Jews, meaning he is elevating himself over Caesar. The Romans believed that Caesar was the only king. Caesar was the God man there to rule over the world, to rule over the nation, the empire of Rome. And so Jesus, to elevate himself like that, was an accusation that the Jews were using to try to put Jesus to death. We can only wonder what Pilate thought when he first set eyes on Jesus, when he saw Jesus beaten and bloodied, this man before him. Jesus didn't look regal. He didn't look majestic. He didn't look like he was a threat to the Caesar. And so he stood before Pilate, the Roman governor, and the Roman governor was probably that statement that the Roman governor that Pilate made was probably very sarcastic or ironic when he asked, are you the king of the Jews? Um, Pilate was evidently not alarmed by the charge brought against Jesus because at first glance he saw that Jesus was not likely to be a pretender to royalty in any sense that he needed to trouble himself about him. In fact, the word are you the king of the Jews? The word "you" is an emphatic statement in that's in verse 11. It's an emphatic statement, and it really suggests that Pilate is saying, "You, the king of the Jews," kind of in a sarcastic tone, something like that. Well, all of this, I don't think Pilate really wanted to mess with this. I don't think Pilate really wanted to crucify Jesus. In fact, that's why Luke says that first Pilate sent him on to Herod, then Herod sent him back to Pilate. It's like this fell in my lap. I don't want to mess with this. I don't believe this guy is guilty. I don't think that he's really done anything. I think this is your concoction, you Jewish leaders, you Jewish religious people. I think you're making all of this up. I don't want to have to mess with Jesus. So it looks like that Pilate marveled about Jesus, that Pilate really treated Jesus differently than what Pilate's character really showed. It seems like Pilate just really hopes to release Jesus. That's really what he wanted to do. And here's how the story goes. Now, at the feast, the governor was accustomed to releasing to the multitude one prisoner whom they wished. And at that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. Therefore, when they had gathered together, Pilate said to them, "Who do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" For Pilate knew that the only reason that they handed Jesus over to him was because they were envious of Jesus. They were jealous of Jesus. That's why they handed him over to Pilate to be killed. And so Pilate gave the multitude a situation that Pilate thought was going to be handled one way, but it was handled a very different way because they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. Barabbas, that idea of notorious prisoner was that he was a murderer. Um, about Pilate, Mark chapter 15 tells us that Barabbas was the reason he was notorious is that he was one of several insurrectionists who had committed murder in the insurrection. We would regard a man like Barabbas as something like a revolutionary terrorist today. That's what he was. He was trying to create an uprising, an insurrection. He would have been responsible for looting and rioting. He would have been responsible for troubles that were happening, for destruction that was happening. He was trying to create a revolution, an uprising, and he would have actually killed people, innocent people, in that uprising. So Pilate, when he asked this question, automatically assume that there's no way that the people would want Barabbas to be released because they all regarded Barabbas as crazy, insurrectionist, murderer, revolutionary. He was rioting and looting and tearing down statues and all of the things that you would see. Pilate, assumed that there's no way that they would have called for Jesus to be killed. They wanted to have Barabbas be killed. Pilate really got to the heart of the people. He did it not through research, he just did it through his reasoning. Maybe his conscience was pricked, But he knew that the only reason that they had handed Jesus over was because of envy. He knew, without even saying it, he knew their motive was wrong. Their motive was envy. It was not any other concern. Their motive was envy, jealousy, hatred. That's the reason they handed Jesus over. All of that hardness of heart, all of that envy, all of that jealousy really results from the bitterness and the anger that is in their hearts. Well, here's what it says. While Pilate, that's he, while Pilate was sitting on the judgment seat. Now that would have been a seat that a leader would have sat on. You sit on this seat, and from this seat you make your judgment call. He was sitting on the judgment seat. By the way, judgment seat is even referenced in the end times judgment. There's the Bema seat, the judgment seat that God will sit upon, and he will judge mankind. There's the judgment that's going to happen. So it's a little bit of a prelude to this. By the way, all of this would have taken place in the where the Roman where the Roman fort was. There was a Roman fort right next to the temple. In fact, most archaeologists, most historians believe that when you look at pictures of Israel and you see people praying against what is called the Western Wall, that Western Wall was not part of the temple, even though some of the Jewish people think it a holy place. They go there to pray, but that wall was not part of the temple. That wall was part of what's called Fort Antonia. Fort Antonia is this place that all of this is happening. That's where Pilate would have been. That's where the Roman garrison would have been housed. It's where the prison would have been. That Barabbas would have been sitting in a prison cell right there. It all happened at Fort Antonia. And so if you look at the Western Wall, that would have been the Western Wall of Fort Antonia. In fact, where the Dome of the Rock is, if you look at pictures, there is a rock that the dome is built upon. They believe that rock is the place that Jesus would have stood, where Pilate would have pronounced judgment upon him. So the interesting thing is that golden dome that is so revered in Islam was the place of judgment. In fact, the temple is not on the Dome of the Rock, and you can go on YouTube and see some of the archaeology videos that have been made, some of the well done documentaries that have been made. That the temple of God was really next to Fort Antonia, so they're off in their estimation. The Dome of the Rock does not have to be torn down. They can build the temple exactly where it needs to be, just a little bit to the west of the Dome of the Rock. And so there's no controversy that will happen. That's what you're going to see rise in the end. So Jesus would have stood where the rock is in the Dome of the Rock, and Pilate would have been sitting on the judgment seat, there pronouncing judgment. Again, just the interesting thought that the place where Jesus was judged is the place where this holy spot in Islam is. It's like a picture of God's judgment upon that region or on that spot. Anyway, he was sitting on the judgment seat. And Pilate's wife sent him a message. His wife sent to him, and it would have come through a messenger. Now, his wife would have not been in Jerusalem because Pilate, the Roman governor's residence, would have been along the coast. Pilate only came and was staying at Fort Antonia because it was Passover time, and he wanted to oversee all of the events of Passover because there were millions of people there in Jerusalem, and he wanted to make sure that law and order was kept. So his wife would have been at their residence along the sea. She would have sent a message to her husband Pilate, and here's the message she sent him: have nothing to do with that just man. Now Pilate should have really regarded this, because how could she have known anything about this situation, because she wasn't even there? Have nothing to do with this just man. I've just suffered many things today in a dream because of him. That was the warning. Now, Now, Pilate had a couple of warnings. Pilate's warnings were, first, I see the motive of the religious leaders' hearts. It's their motive is envy, but the real motive is anger and bitterness and hatred. Then he had the warning of the way that Jesus acted. He didn't act like some insurrectionist. He didn't act like a king. He didn't act like he was trying to overthrow the Roman government. He was humble and he was quiet. And then he had the warning of his wife giving the warning of a dream that she had. If Pilate had listened to the clues, he would have just let Jesus go. But Pilate did not do that. And then it says this, but the chief priests and the elders persuaded the multitudes that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. And so it's amazing how wicked leaders can influence the crowd. Wicked leaders can influence the multitudes, and the multitudes are just like sheep who will follow whatever their wicked leaders say. Just let that sink in for all that's happening in the world today. Wicked leaders can influence the multitude to do their bidding, to follow, and like sheep, they will be led astray. And so Pilate, as he's sitting on the judgment seat, had all the evidence he needed to do the right thing, to release Jesus. He saw the strength and dignity of Jesus. He knew that he was not a criminal or revolutionary. He knew that it was not a just charge, that they had the wrong motive in bringing him for judgment. He saw that Jesus was a man so at peace that he didn't even have to answer a single accusation. And he had already declared Jesus an innocent man in Luke chapter 23, verse 4, in the first encounter that Pilate had with Jesus. He said, I find no fault in this man. And that's where he sent him on to Herod. And then his wife gave him that picture of a dream. Charles Spurgeon said this about the dream, or dreams. He said, most dreams we quite forget. A few we mention as remarkable, and only now and then one is impressed upon us so that we remember it for years. Scarcely have any of you had a dream which made you send a message to a magistrate upon the bench. That's the power of the dream that she had. Because of all of this, because of this dream, she had great urgency about her message to Pilate. She was bold to send it. She implored him to simply have nothing to do with him. Let him go, send him away. Don't punish him even a little bit. But it was an influence that he tragically, and a message and a warning that he tragically ignored. All of this was God's merciful message to Pilate, a merciful message that was rejected. It was a message that was given to the people. Jesus is innocent. He cares about you. It was a message given to the religious leaders. It was a message given to Pilate himself. Instead of listening to the warnings of God, they wanted him to die. In Pilate, here's a man who knows the right thing to do and knows it by many convincing ways, yet he will do the wrong thing, a terrible thing, in obedience to the multitude. Now, make that a personal thought in your own life. You know the right thing to do. You know it in many convincing ways. You've heard many warning signs, yet you willfully and purposely do the wrong thing, a terrible thing, in obedience to what your flesh is saying, in obedience to what other people are saying. There are times in my life that I have done that I've known the right thing to do. I've known it in many convincing ways. Warnings have been given. God has given the warnings, and yet I've still done the wrong thing, a terrible thing, in an obedience to the flesh or an obedience to the crowd rather than in obedience to God. Adam Clarke, the Bible commentator, said this. It says, but this it appears they did at the instigation of the chief priests, the calling for Jesus to be crucified. We see here how dangerous wicked priests are in the Church of Christ. When pastors are corrupt, they are capable of inducing their flock to prefer Barabbas to Jesus, the world to God, and the pleasures of sense to the salvation of their souls. Well, here's what it says next. The governor asked and said to them, which of the two do you want me to release to you? Again, he thought They were going to say Jesus, but they said Barabbas. Pilate said to them, "What then shall I do with Jesus who is called the Christ?" They all said to him, "Let him be crucified." Then the governor said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they cried out all the more, saying, "Let him be crucified." When wicked leaders stir up the crowd, they can do envy without any thought, without any reason, without any evidence of why they should do so. The call for "let him be crucified" is it's just remarkable to come from the lips of a Jewish crowd, because they despised crucifixion, because crucifixion was a Roman punishment. It was abhorrent to the Jews. They hated this practice by the Roman people. They would have had relatives that they knew, friends that they knew that were crucified. They crucified people dozens at a time. They hated crucifixion, did the Jews. And so for the Jews to cry out, "Let him be crucified," is absolutely remarkable. When the crowd chose Barabbas instead of Jesus, it reflected the fallen nature of all humanity. By the way, the name Barabbas is a word that sounds very similar to the son of a father. The word Abba in the Greek language is the word for a son, or for a dad. The word for grandfather is Saba. The word for father is Abba. Son of is Bar Jonah, the name of the son of Jonah. That's how they would refer to a son. Barabbas, the son of father. The people chose a false, violent son of the Father instead of the true Son of the Father. Just note that little nugget of truth that is hidden in this. They chose a false, violent Son of the Father instead of the true Son of the Father. This is a prophetic statement. It prefigures the future embrace that the world will have of the ultimate Barabbas, son of a father, the one popularly called the Antichrist. It was a false, violent son that they chose over the true son, the son of the true God. They will choose a son of Satan rather than a son of the Father God. It shows the nature of fallen humanity. Charles Spurgeon says this: "I impeach humanity, again, of the utmost possible folly, because in crucifying Christ, it crucified its best friend. Jesus Christ was not only the friend of man, so as to take human nature upon himself, but he was the friend of sinners, so that he came into the world to seek and to save that which was lost." John Trapp, the Bible commentator, says people today still reject Jesus and choose another. Their Barabbas might be lust, it might be intoxication, it might be self and the comforts of life. This mad choice is every day made, while men prefer the lusts of their flesh before the lives of their souls. Do you get that? Instead of crying out, "Jesus, save me. Jesus, help me. Jesus, come into my life. Jesus, show me mercy," they cry out, "Jesus, crucify him. Jesus, kill him. We want nothing." They choose their own selfish desires, their own lusts. They go with the crowd rather than listening to the voice of God. They cried out, "Barabbas. We want Barabbas. We want the son of the Father," but they're choosing the wrong son of the wrong Father instead of choosing the right son of the right Father. Well, let's conclude the story. When Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising, he took water, he washed his hands symbolically before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it. And the people answered and said, His blood be on us and our children. Now, it was very very out of character. It was uncharacteristic for Pilate to bend this way to the religious leaders and the crowd. He could have chosen differently. In fact, Pilate never regarded what the crowd thought. He never cared what the Jewish people thought. He did what he wanted to do. If Pilate really believed Jesus was innocent, he would have just said, no, he's innocent. I'm not putting him to death. And he would have let Jesus go. Instead, he bent to the crowd. He bent to the religious leaders. Pilate washed his hands symbolically, saying, it's out of my control. Personally, I wish Jesus no harm, but these things happen. Yet the power and responsibility of what to do with Jesus rested upon him. Saying, I find no fault in him was not enough. Looking for a clever solution and releasing a prisoner at Passover was no solution. Washing his hands was meaningless. He could not escape, and he would not escape the responsibility. And he is forever associated with the crime of sending Jesus to the cross, echoed through history in the creeds. Crucified under Pontius Pilate. He could not escape. He could not ever undo what he did. Washing his hands, saying, it's not my fault, is not enough. Pilate had control. Pilate could have made the decision. Pilate did not have to listen to the crowd. Pilate was the ruler. Pilate never thought about the crowd. He never cared about the crowd, but he bent his will to what the crowd wanted instead of standing up and doing what was right. By him saying, I'm innocent of this, of the blood of this just person, he's trying to declare Jesus, well, he's hidden in there. He's declaring Jesus was innocent. He was declaring that Jesus was not guilty. But Pilate, all of that guilt will come upon him. All of that guilt will be put upon him because he did what was wrong. William Barclay said this, strangely, in later periods of Christian anti-Semitism, which is horrible and wrong, some Christians tried to rehabilitate Pilate or recast Pilate, create a new narrative about Pilate. They wanted to put all the blame on the Jews. Some have even said that Pilate and his wife became Christians, and to this day, in some churches, they consider Pilate and his wife to be saints. That's just horrific and wrong. The Jews cried out, His blood be on us and our children. They had no understanding of what they were asking for. They didn't understand the glory of Jesus' cleansing blood and how wonderful it would be to have his blood on them and their children. They didn't understand the enormity of the crime of calling, excuse me, for the execution of a sinless Son of God and the judgment that would be visited on their children. That judgment is going to come about 40 years from the date that this happens, when all of Rome will surround Jerusalem, wipe all of Jerusalem out, kill millions of people. All of the blood will fall upon the people in a form of judgment, but his blood falls upon us in the form of cleansing when we come to Jesus by faith and accept him as the true Son of God. Well, tomorrow, in our study, we're going to see the final events, the scourging of Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus, and the death of Jesus. I hope today was meaningful to you, and I hope that you'll join me back here as we get back into our study of the Gospel of Matthew in tomorrow's daily devotional. Join me then. Have a great day. We'll see you tomorrow.